Every day at the same time, he received a call, from himself. Detective Ben Carter didn't believe in the supernatural. He had built his career on facts, evidence, and logical deduction, the cornerstones of proper police work. In 15 years with the Boston Police Department, he'd seen his share of strange cases, but nothing that couldn't be explained by human nature and the dark corners of the psyche. But what had been happening for the past 2 weeks defied explanation. Every evening, at precisely 10:17 p.m., his phone would ring. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, one that changed slightly each time. And when he answered, he heard his own voice on the line. "Don't go home." The first time it happened, Ben had laughed it off as a prank. Voice manipulation technology was readily available these days. Some rookie at the precinct was probably having a laugh at his expense. The second night, when the call came again at exactly 10:17, his amusement gave way to annoyance. By the third night, that annoyance had transformed into uneasy curiosity. By the end of the first week, it had morphed into something else entirely, dread. Because it wasn't just the voice that matched his own. It was the cadence, the specific way he cleared his throat before speaking, the slight Boston accent he'd tried for years to shed. Little details no voice manipulation software could perfectly replicate. And there was something in the tone, a desperate urgency, that sent chills down his spine. Ben had exhausted every logical explanation. He'd run the numbers through the department's database. Nothing. He'd checked his phone records. According to them, the calls had never happened. He'd even set up a recording device, but when he played back the recordings, there was nothing but static. Tonight was Friday, the end of a particularly grueling week. A double homicide in South Boston had kept him at his desk well past his normal hours. The case was a mess, no witnesses, no obvious motive, just 2 bodies and a crime scene that had been scrubbed clean. Ben rubbed his eyes and glanced at his watch. 10:15 p.m. 2 minutes until the call. His desk phone sat silent and innocent before him, a plain black office model, standard issue for the department. His cell phone rested beside it, screen dark. Which one would ring tonight? The precinct was mostly empty. The overhead fluorescents hummed, casting everything in a harsh, unflattering light. Down the hall, he could hear the cleaning staff's vacuum, the sound oddly comforting in its mundanity. 10:16 p.m. 1 minute to go. Ben found himself holding his breath. His palms were damp. This was ridiculous. He was a decorated detective, not some superstitious rookie. And yet, his cell phone vibrated, right on schedule. The screen displayed a number he didn't recognize, though by now, he'd come to expect that. His finger hovered over the answer button for a moment before he steeled himself and accepted the call. "Who are you?" Ben demanded, abandoning the usual pretense of professionalism. His voice echoed slightly in the empty office. There was a pause, a moment of static, and then his own voice replied, hoarse and strained. "If you go home tonight, you'll die." The line went dead. Ben stared at his phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was different. The previous warnings had been vague, "Don't go home," but this was explicit. A direct threat. He quickly tried to call the number back, but as always, an automated voice informed him the number was no longer in service. He slammed the phone down on his desk. "Everything okay, Carter?" Ben startled. He hadn't heard Lieutenant Diane Roberts approach. She stood in the doorway of the office space, her jacket on, clearly on her way out. "Yeah," he said, smoothing down his tie in a nervous gesture. Just a case getting to me." Roberts nodded sympathetically. In her 25 years on the force, she'd seen plenty of detectives get consumed by their work. The South Boston double. Among other things, Ben said vaguely. He considered telling her about the calls but stopped himself. What would he say? That he was receiving threatening calls from himself? That would earn him a mandatory psychiatric evaluation, if not a complete removal from active duty. Don't stay too late, Roberts advised. Sometimes stepping away is the best thing you can do for a case. Fresh eyes in the morning. After she left, Ben sat in silence, contemplating his options. The logical part of his brain, the detective, the skeptic, was cataloging possibilities. A sophisticated prank. A technical glitch. Perhaps even early symptoms of a mental health issue. Auditory hallucinations weren't unheard of in high-stress professions. But another part of him, a primal instinct he'd learned to trust over the years, was screaming danger. He thought about his home, a modest two-story house in a quiet suburb 20 minutes outside the city. He'd bought it after his divorce 3 years ago, seeking peace and distance from the chaos of his work. It was nothing special: 4 walls, a roof, a small yard he rarely had time to maintain. But it was his sanctuary. And something was waiting for him there tonight. Ben grabbed his jacket and his service weapon. He checked the magazine, a habit born from years on the force, then holstered the gun. He was being ridiculous, he knew. But he also knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he'd checked his house. As he drove through the nighttime streets of Boston, the city lights blurred around him. His mind raced with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Was someone stalking him? Was this related to a case? He'd put away plenty of dangerous criminals over the years. Perhaps one of them was orchestrating an elaborate scheme for revenge. But how would they replicate his voice so perfectly? And why the cryptic warnings? If someone wanted to harm him, why warn him away from his house? The suburban streets were quiet as he turned onto his block. Most homes were dark at this hour, with only the occasional window still illuminated. Ben slowed his car as he approached his house, scanning for anything unusual. From the outside, everything looked normal. The porch light was on. He always left it on when he knew he'd be home late. But as he pulled into the driveway, his stomach dropped. The lights were on inside his house. All of them, living room, kitchen, upstairs bedroom, blazing through the windows. Ben was meticulously careful about turning off lights before leaving. He'd grown up with a father who'd lecture about electricity bills, and the habit had stuck. He distinctly remembered turning everything off that morning. Someone was in his house. Ben cut the engine but left the keys in the ignition. He unholstered his weapon and exited the car quietly, staying low. The night was silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the chirping of crickets. No unusual vehicles were parked nearby. No signs of forced entry from what he could see. He moved cautiously up the front walk, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. The porch steps creaked slightly under his weight, a sound so familiar it was almost comforting in its normalcy. The front door was locked. Ben stood to the side as he inserted his key, then pushed the door open with his foot, gun at the ready. "Boston PD," he called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Identify yourself." Nothing but silence greeted him. Ben entered his home, moving with the practiced precision of his training. He cleared the entryway and proceeded to the living room, gun sweeping the space methodically. The room was empty, but signs of occupation were everywhere. The TV was on, muted, playing a late-night talk show. A half-empty glass of whiskey, his preferred brand, sat on the coffee table. His favorite recliner showed the indentation of someone having recently sat there. It was as if he'd been home all evening, except he hadn't. "This is Detective Ben Carter," he called out again, louder this time. "I am armed. Show yourself immediately." Again, nothing but silence. He moved to the kitchen next. The light above the stove cast a warm glow over the space. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the coffee maker was on, a fresh pot brewed. The scent of his usual dark roast filled the air, oddly comforting despite the circumstances. A chill ran down Ben's spine. Whoever was in his house knew his habits intimately. The dining room was clear, as was the small home office he rarely used. That left upstairs, bedrooms and bathroom, or the basement. A faint sound caught his attention. Something from upstairs. A creak of floorboards, so slight he almost missed it. Someone was up there. Ben approached the staircase, his back to the wall, gun pointed upward. The wooden steps had always announced his presence with their creaking. There would be no silent ascent. He'd have to rely on speed and the element of surprise. Taking a deep breath, he charged up the stairs, taking them two at a time to minimize the noise. At the top, he immediately pressed himself against the wall of the hallway, scanning for threats. The master bedroom door was ajar, light spilling into the hallway. Ben could hear movement now, unmistakable. Someone shifting their weight, breathing. "I know you're in there," Ben called out, his finger hovering near the trigger of his gun. "Come out with your hands up." A voice responded, his voice, calm and measured. "I've been waiting for you, Ben. Though I did hope you'd heed my warning this time." Ben felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. The voice was unmistakably his own, but not coming from a phone or recording. It was full-bodied, present, emanating from his bedroom. The door swung open fully. Ben's heart nearly stopped. Standing in the doorway of his bedroom was, himself. Not someone who resembled him, not a twin or a doppelganger, but him. Ben Carter, down to the smallest detail. The same slightly crooked nose from a break that hadn't healed properly. The same scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood accident. Even the same clothes he was wearing now, dark suit, blue tie, slightly rumpled from a long day at work. The only difference was a thin line of dried blood running from the double's temple down to his jaw. Ben's gun wavered in his hand as shock paralyzed him momentarily. He'd expected many things, an intruder, a prankster, perhaps even nothing at all, but not this. Not the impossible. "Who?" Ben's voice caught in his throat. "What are you?" The double, the other Ben, smiled sadly. "I told you. I'm you." He gestured toward a chair in the corner of the bedroom. "Please, sit down. We don't have much time." Ben kept his gun trained on the figure. "I'm not sitting anywhere. Explain what's going on. Now." The double sighed, a familiar gesture that sent another chill through Ben. "I understand your skepticism. I was just as skeptical a week ago, when I was standing where you are now." "A week ago?" Ben demanded. "What are you talking about?" "This isn't the first time this has happened," the double explained calmly. "We're caught in a loop, you and I. A loop that always ends the same way." He pointed to the dried blood on his face. "With one of us dead." Ben's mind raced. This had to be some elaborate hoax, a twin he never knew about, an actor with eerily similar features, anything but what it appeared to be. "That's impossible." "I thought so too," the double replied. "Until I lived through it. Until I died through it." He took a step forward, and Ben tightened his grip on his gun. "I know what you're thinking. You're cataloging every logical explanation, a hoax, a hallucination, a mental break from reality. I did the same thing. But you know, deep down, that none of those explanations fit what you're seeing right now." Ben could feel sweat beading on his forehead. The double was right. No matter how he tried to rationalize what was happening, nothing made sense. "Let me ask you something," the double continued. "What day do you think today is?" "Friday," Ben answered automatically. "The date?" "March 17th. The double smiled grimly. "Now, what's the last thing you clearly remember doing before today?" Ben opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Images flashed through his mind, the double homicide case from the week, paperwork, meetings. But as he tried to recall specific details, specific conversations, they slipped away like smoke. "Thursday," he said finally. I remember Thursday's briefing. We got the ballistics back on the South Boston case. And after that, the double pressed. Ben found himself unable to answer. There was a blank space in his memory, a gap where Friday should have been. The double nodded, as if Ben's silence confirmed something. You don't remember because for you, Thursday night was just a few hours ago. You've lost time, but you haven't noticed yet. That's ridiculous, Ben said, but doubt had begun to creep in. I've been working the South Boston case all day. Have you? The double challenged. Can you tell me a single specific thing you did today? A conversation you had? A meal you ate? Ben struggled to recall details, but everything was fuzzy, indistinct. Generic memories of desk work and phone calls, but nothing concrete that would anchor the day in reality. What's happening to me? Ben's voice was barely above a whisper. To us, the double corrected. I don't have all the answers, but I know this, something happened last Friday that trapped us in a loop. Every day, I try to warn you, warn myself, not to come home. And every day, you do anyway. The phone calls, Ben said, pieces starting to click into place. That was you? The double nodded. I've tried different warnings, different approaches. Nothing works. You always come home, and it always ends the same way. Ben lowered his gun slightly, his mind reeling. What happens? How does it end? Before the double could answer, a noise from downstairs caught both men's attention, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. The double's face drained of color. He's here. Again. Who's here? Ben demanded, raising his gun again. You need to hide, the double said urgently, moving toward Ben. Now. Ben backed away. I'm not hiding anywhere until you explain what's going on. There's no time, the double insisted. Listen to me. There are 3 of us now. The one who just entered, he thinks he's the real Ben Carter too. But he's not. Neither of us is. Not anymore. Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. Please, the double begged. At least keep out of sight until you understand what's happening. Against his better judgment, Ben allowed himself to be ushered into the master bathroom adjacent to the bedroom. The double left the door cracked open just enough for Ben to peer through. From his hiding spot, Ben watched as another identical version of himself entered the bedroom, gun drawn. This third Ben looked exactly like him and the double, down to the same clothes, but with no blood on his face. I knew I'd find you here, the newcomer said, his voice cold as he addressed the double. You can't break the cycle. I'm trying to, the double responded. This time is different. He's hiding, listening. Maybe if he understands. It won't matter, the third Ben cut him off. It never does. We've played this out a dozen ways already. Ben's head was spinning. 3 identical versions of himself, all claiming to be him, all apparently trapped in some impossible loop. How many times? The double asked quietly. This is the 5th iteration I've experienced, the third Ben answered. But who knows how many came before my awareness began. The double nodded grimly. And it always ends the same way. Always, the third Ben confirmed, raising his gun to point directly at the double's chest. Ben couldn't stay hidden any longer. He burst from the bathroom, his own weapon raised. Stop. Both of you, don't move. The third Ben didn't seem surprised by his appearance. So you brought him into it directly this time. Interesting approach, but it won't work. What are you going to do? Ben demanded, his gun swinging between his 2 duplicates. What always happens, the third Ben replied calmly. One of us dies. One of us makes the calls. One of us discovers the truth. He smiled thinly. The roles rotate, but the play remains the same. This is insane, Ben said, his hand trembling slightly on his weapon. Insanity would be a mercy, the double said softly. This is something worse. Ben took a step back, trying to process what was happening. If what you're saying is true, how did this start? What caused it? The third Ben shrugged. Each of us has a theory. Mine is that we died, the original Ben Carter died, in this house, 1 week ago. Something violent and unexpected. And instead of moving on, his consciousness fractured, creating this loop. I think it's something in the house, the double offered. Something that warps time and reality. I've been searching for it between cycles. Ben shook his head, still unable to fully accept what he was hearing. And what happens next? In this cycle? Violence, the third Ben said simply. Then reset. Then it all begins again. No, Ben said firmly, gripping his gun tighter. I refuse to accept that. There has to be a way to break this cycle. The double looked at him with something like hope. That's what I've been trying to do with the phone calls. Change the variables, create a different outcome. It won't work, the third Ben insisted. I've tried more direct methods in previous cycles. The universe course corrects. Ben's detective mind was racing, analyzing the situation as he would a case. Every cycle can't be identical. There must be differences, variations we can exploit. The third Ben laughed bitterly. Like what? I've tried leaving the city, I crashed my car 5 miles down the road. He nodded toward the double, tried to tell others, they either didn't believe him or forgot the conversation immediately. The walls of this trap are solid. No case is unsolvable, Ben insisted, lowering his gun slightly. Let's put our heads together. 3 versions of the same detective, we should be able to figure this out. For a moment, it seemed like his words had gotten through. The third Ben's expression softened slightly, and he lowered his weapon a fraction. Then the bedroom lights flickered. It's starting, the double whispered, fear evident in his voice. What's starting? Ben demanded. The third Ben raised his gun again, this time aiming it at Ben. The reset. It always begins with the lights. The house creaked around them, a deep, groaning sound like wood under immense pressure. The lights flickered again, more violently this time. Wait, Ben urged, holding up a hand. We don't have to do this. We can find another way. There is no other way, the third Ben said, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ben's police training took over. He dove to the side as the shot rang out, rolling and coming up with his own weapon aimed. But he was too slow. A second shot echoed in the bedroom. Ben felt a sharp, burning pain in his chest. He looked down to see a dark stain spreading across his shirt. As he fell to his knees, he saw the double tackle the third Ben. They struggled, 2 identical men locked in mortal combat. Another shot rang out. The third Ben went limp. The double, now the only other Ben left standing, rushed to his side. I'm sorry, he said, pressing his hands to Ben's wound. It always ends this way. One survives to make the calls. One dies here. One arrives to complete the cycle. Ben could feel his consciousness fading, the edges of his vision darkening. Next time, he gasped, tell me earlier. Give me more time to understand. The double nodded, tears in his eyes. I'll try. I always try. As darkness closed in, Ben's last thought was a question: would he be the caller next time, or would he be doomed to repeat this night of discovery again? The bedroom lights flickered once more, then went out completely. In the darkness, a phone began to ring. The cycle continued. Who was truly alive, and who was dead? In the infinite loop of time, perhaps the question itself had lost all meaning.